A wedding videotape captures the last time the bride was seen alive. The cheap fluorescent lights of the police interrogation room hummed, a flat, dead sound that vibrated in my teeth. It was the only sound. For how long, I couldn't say. Time had dissolved into a syrupy, slow-motion dread since they'd first sat me in this plastic chair. Its legs bolted to the linoleum floor. Across the metal table, Detective Harding stared at me, his eyes small and dark like two polished river stones. He hadn't blinked, not once. He was a statue of cheap cologne and quiet menace. "Let's watch it again, Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the concrete walls themselves. He didn't look at the laptop sitting between us. He just kept his eyes on me, searching for the cracks he was sure were there. My lawyer, a public defender named Miller with a frayed collar and the exhausted eyes of a man who'd seen too many of these rooms, shifted beside me. "Detective, my client has been here for 6 hours. He's answered every question. This is harassment." Harding ignored him. He reached out a thick, sausage-like finger and pressed the spacebar. The laptop screen, which had been dark, flickered to life, and there she was. Lara. My breath hitched. A sharp, painful thing in my chest. It always did. For the 1000th time, I was back in that sun-drenched garden, the air thick with the scent of roses and champagne. The video was raw, shaky. Footage from the wedding videographer's second camera, the one meant to capture the candid moments. It was too candid. It was a ghost. Alara was laughing, her head thrown back, the column of her throat exposed and vulnerable. A string of pearls, my wedding gift to her, rested in the hollow of her neck. Her dress, a simple slip of ivory silk, clung to her body as she swayed to the music, a glass of champagne held loosely in her hand. She was dancing with her father, a man whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated joy. He spun her, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes met the camera's lens. They were bright, impossibly bright, sparkling with a future that was only hours away from being stolen. "Stop," I croaked. The word was a dry rasp, swallowed by the humming lights. Harding's lips tightened into a smirk. "Why, Leo? This is the good part." On the screen, my own face appeared, younger, happier. A stranger wearing my skin. I was cutting the cake with her, our hands clasped together over the silver knife. We were clumsy, laughing as the first slice toppled onto the table. I watched myself dab a spot of frosting from her nose, and the intimacy of the gesture, now displayed on this cold, sterile screen, felt obscene. It was a memory that belonged to me, to us, and they had turned it into evidence. "Exhibit A, pay attention," Harding commanded. His voice sharpened up, the camera panned away from us, sweeping across the laughing faces of our guests. Her bridesmaids in their pale blue dresses. My groomsmen, already drunk and loud. And then, it settled on him, Julian, my brother, my best man. He was standing near the edge of the marquee, partially hidden by a floral arrangement. He wasn't watching us. He was watching Ilara. There was no joy on his face, only a raw, consuming hunger that I, in my champagne-fueled bliss, had been too blind to see. He held his glass so tightly his knuckles were white. As Ilara turned, her back to him, he took a step forward, his mouth opening as if to call her name. But he didn't, he just watched. "There," Harding said, pausing the frame. He leaned forward, the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes washing over me. "That's the look, you see it, don't you? The look of a man who wants something he can't have." I stared at my brother's frozen face, the brother I had idolized, the one who had stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, as I'd pledged my life to Elara. The memory was a poisoned knife, twisting in my gut. He loved her, I whispered, the admission tasting like ash. But he wouldn't, wouldn't he? Harding pressed play. Again, the video continued. The sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The fairy lights strung around the garden flickered on, casting a magical glow. The party was thinning out. My parents were leaving, hugging us both, my mother weeping with joy, Ilara's parents, their faces beaming. Then came the last moment. The final frame. Illyra was standing by the old stone well at the far end of the garden. The videographer must have been packing up, catching the shot by accident. She was looking, over her shoulder, back towards the house, a small, uncertain smile on her lips. The silk of her dress shimmered in the twilight. She raised a hand, as if waving to someone, or beckoning them, and then she turned and walked away, disappearing behind a thick curtain of overgrown ivy that covered the garden wall. The camera held on the spot for a few seconds longer, the empty space where she had been. Then, the footage cut to black. That was it. The last time anyone saw her alive. Harding snapped the laptop shut. The sudden silence was more deafening than the hum. "She walks away," he said, his voice soft now, deceptively so. "No one sees her leave the grounds. No car is heard. An hour later, you, Leo, report her missing. You're frantic, distraught. The perfect grieving husband." He leaned back, his chair creaking in protest. "But the dress, Leo. That's the part that gets me." My blood ran cold. The dress. Her wedding dress. It was found 2 days later, snagged on a branch, in the woods a mile from your venue. It was torn, and it was covered in mud and blood. He paused, letting the word hang in the air, not hers. "We ran the DNA, Leo. It was yours." The room tilted. Miller put a steadying hand on my arm, but I barely felt it. My mind was a maelstrom of confusion and terror. My blood how I remembered the search parties, the desperate, frantic hours I'd spent crashing through that same forest, calling her name until my throat was raw. I'd stumbled, fallen, cut myself on branches. In the dark, of course my blood was there. I was looking for her. I yelled, my voice cracking. I was bleeding. I fell. Or, Harding countered, leaning in again, his face inches from mine. "The two of you had a fight. The perfect wedding wasn't so perfect after all. Maybe she told you she'd made a mistake. Maybe she mentioned your brother's name, and you snapped. You grabbed her, you shook her, you tore that pretty little dress. You dragged her into those woods, and you—" He didn't need to finish. The accusation was a physical thing, a phantom hand closing around my throat, squeezing the air from my lungs. "No," I gasped. "No, no, no, where is she, Leo?" Harding's voice was a whip crack. "What did you do with your wife's body?" I looked from his merciless face to Miller's worried one. They didn't believe me. No one would. I was the husband, the last one to see her, the one whose blood was on her dress. I was the perfect suspect. A wave of nausea washed over me. I thought of Elleros' smile, the warmth of her hand in mine, the future we had planned. A house, children, a lifetime. All of it erased in a single moment, replaced by this humming, suffocating room. "I don't know," I choked out, the words tearing me apart. "I swear to God, I don't know." Harding smiled, a slow, cruel curve of his lips. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Don't worry," he said, standing up, his shadow falling over me like a shroud. "We've got all the time in the world, and we'll keep watching this video. Again, and again, and again, until you remember." He walked out, leaving me alone with Miller and the ghost on the screen. The humming of the lights seemed to grow louder, burrowing into my skull. I stared at the blank laptop, but all I could see was her face, Illyra, waving, smiling, walking into the darkness, and a single, terrifying thought screamed through the chaos in my mind. She hadn't been waving at me. She had been looking past me, towards the marquee, towards the shadows where my brother stood. The cliffhanger wasn't just where she went. It was who she was walking towards. My mind reeled, replaying that final ghostly image. Her smile wasn't for me. It was for someone else. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been so lost in my own happiness that I hadn't seen the world around me, the currents moving just beneath the surface. Miller was saying something, his voice a distant buzz. "Leo, listen to me. Don't say another word. We need to focus." They have nothing but circumstantial evidence. But they had the video. They had the dress. And they had my blood. In the stark, unforgiving logic of a police investigation, that was everything. I was the husband, the one with the motive of a spurned lover, a man whose perfect day had been shattered. It was a story as old as time, and Harding was going to write me as the villain. My thoughts spiraled back to Julian. My brother. We had been inseparable as kids, two halves of a whole. But as we grew older, a chasm had formed between us. He was the brilliant one, the charismatic one, the one who could charm anyone. I was the steady one, the quiet one. When I met Elara, it was like the sun had finally broken through the clouds of my own self-doubt. She saw me. Not as Julian's shadow, but as me. Had he resented that? Had his love for her, a love I never even knew existed, curdled into something toxic? The image of his face in the video, that raw hunger, burned behind my eyelids. He was looking at her like a starving man looks at a feast. "The well," I whispered, the sound startling in the quiet room. "What?" Miller leaned closer. "The well." She was standing by the well. My voice gained strength. "It's old, it's been covered for decades, but the stonework is loose. We were told to warn guests to stay away from it." A new, colder dread seeped into my bones. What if she hadn't walked into the woods? What if she had never left the garden? Did they search the well? I asked, my eyes locking with Miller's. He frowned. "I don't know. The police report is preliminary. They focused on the woods because of the dress. They have to search the well." I insisted, my voice rising with a desperate urgency. Now, I was no longer just a grieving husband. I was a man in a cage, and the only way out was to find the truth, no matter how monstrous it might be. The video was a lie. It showed a happy couple, a perfect day. But the truth was in the spaces between the frames. In the glances no one was supposed to see. In the secrets that festered in the shadows. Harding thought he had his story, his neat little narrative of a domestic dispute gone wrong. But he was wrong. The real story, the one that ended with my wife vanishing into thin air, was far darker and more twisted than he could ever imagine. And I was beginning to realize that I wasn't the only one in that room with a secret. My brother, the best man, the hidden watcher, had one too. And I had a sickening feeling that his secret was buried at the bottom of that old stone well, along with my wife. The final shot of the video wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a nightmare, from which I might never wake up. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent. My life was over. Ilare's was over. And the show was just getting started. Ilara, her name was a melody, a whisper of wind through summer leaves. To see her was to understand the color blue, not the melancholy shade of a rainy afternoon, but the infinite, breathtaking blue of a cloudless sky stretching into forever. She had a way of listening, her head tilted slightly, her hazel eyes focused with an intensity that made you feel like you were the only person in the universe. It was this quality, this profound stillness in a world of noise, that had first drawn me to her. I was a man made of quiet corners and unspoken thoughts. And she was the one who had gently opened the door and let the light in. We met in a dusty, forgotten corner of a university library. I was researching archaic cartography. For my architecture thesis, she was sketching the anatomy of a flower for a botany class. Her charcoal smudged fingers, the stray curl of dark hair that had escaped her bun. The absolute concentration on her facet was a portrait of serene passion. I'd stumbled, dropping a stack of heavy books with a thunderous crash that echoed. Through the hallowed silence, she hadn't just looked up. She'd smiled, a slow, radiant smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Even the maps want to get a closer look," she'd said, her voice like warm honey. In that moment, my meticulously planned world, a world of right angles and solid foundations, had been beautifully, irrevocably altered. Our courtship was a montage of simple things made extraordinary by her presence. Walks through rain-soaked city streets, sharing a single umbrella. Late-night talks in my cramped apartment. The air thick with the smell of turpentine from my canvases and the jasmine tea she loved. She taught me how to see the world, not as a series of structures to be designed, but as a living, breathing poem. She found beauty in the rust on a fire escape, the chaos of a pigeon flock taking flight, the delicate tracery of a crack in the pavement. She was the artist. I was just the architect who had been lucky enough to design a life with her, but there was a fragility to her, a shadow in her past that she rarely spoke of. Her parents had died in a car crash when she was 16, leaving her in the care of a distant, emotionally sterile aunt. The grief was a locked room inside her, one she only occasionally opened. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would wake to find her staring out the window, her silhouette etched against the moonlight, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She never spoke of these moments, and I never pressed. I simply held her, offering the silent comfort of my presence, hoping my love could be a bulwark against the ghosts that haunted her. This quiet sorrow, this unhealed wound, made me love her all the more fiercely. It made me want to build a fortress of happiness around her, a place so bright the shadows could never find her again. Our wedding was meant to be the cornerstone of that fortress. Then there was Julian, my brother. If I was the steady earth, Julian was the raging fire. He lived in a world of grand gestures and high stakes. A successful investment banker, he moved through life with a slick, predatory grace, his tailored suits and confident smile a form of armor. He was the sun to my moon, and for most of our lives, I had been content to exist in his reflected glow. He was charming, witty, and possessed a reckless energy that drew people to him like moths to a flame. But the flame often burned those who got too close. Our childhood was a tapestry of his daring and my caution. He was the one climbing the tallest trees, and I was the one waiting at the bottom with the first aid kit. He was the one breaking hearts, and I was the one offering a clumsy, apologetic shoulder to the girls he left in his wake. Our parents, in their well-meaning way, had encouraged the dynamic. "Leo, you need to be more like your brother," my father would say. "Julian, try to be a bit more sensible, like Leo." We were defined by our opposition to each other. When I introduced him to Alara, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes I'd never seen before. It wasn't just appreciation for her beauty, it was a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a momentary freezing of his entire being. He had been in the middle of a boisterous story, the center of attention, as always, but the sight of her had silenced him. He recovered quickly, of course, turning on the full force of his charm, his voice smooth and captivating. "Leo," he'd said, clapping me on the back, while his eyes never left hers. "You always did have a knack for finding hidden treasures." I had mistaken his intensity for brotherly approval. I was proud to show him that I, the quiet one, had found someone so extraordinary. I didn't see the possessiveness in his gaze, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes when she looked at me. Ilara, with her innate kindness, was polite to him, but she kept a subtle distance. She saw the fire, and she knew not to get too close, I think. On some level, she sensed the danger he represented. "He's a lot," she'd said to me once, a masterpiece of gentle understatement. I'd laughed, oblivious. "That's just Julian," I'd replied, as if that explained everything. The hidden witness was a boy named Sam. He was only 17. The nephew of the wedding venue's owner, roped into bussing tables and collecting empty glasses for $100. He was a creature of the periphery, a ghost in a cheap black uniform, his movements silent and unobtrusive. Sam lived in a world of his own, a world filtered through the headphones that were perpetually around his neck, even when no music was playing. They were a shield, a way to muffle the noise of a world that had never been particularly kind to him. Sam's past was a quiet litany of neglect. His father had left when he was a baby, and his mother was a wraith who drifted from one dead-end job to the next, her presence in his life as fleeting as smoke. He'd been raised by the television, by video games, by the stoic, silent company of his own thoughts. He was an observer by nature, a boy who had learned to survive by making himself invisible. He noticed things others missed. The nervous tick of a guest trying to impress his date, the forced smile of the mother of the groom, the way the bride's hand trembled slightly as she cut the cake. On the day of the wedding, he had been drawn to Alara, not with the predatory hunger of Julian, but with a kind of quiet awe. He saw the sadness that clung to her like a faint perfume, the vulnerability beneath the radiant smile. She reminded him of a character from one of his fantasy novels, a princess with a secret sorrow. He'd watched her from a distance, feeling a strange, protective instinct. He was the one who saw Julian follow her towards the well. He had been clearing glasses from a table near the edge of the marquee when he saw her walk away from the lights and the music, a solitary figure moving towards the deepening twilight. A moment later, he saw Julian detach himself from a conversation, his movements swift and deliberate, and follow the same path. Sam had hesitated, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. It felt wrong. The way Julian moved was not the way a man moves when he is going to congratulate his brother's new wife. It was the way a wolf moves when it is stalking its prey. Sam had pulled his headphones over his ears, a reflexive gesture to block out the world. But he hadn't turned on his music. He had stood there, frozen, a silent, unseen witness to a prelude he didn't understand. He saw them standing by the well, their figures silhouetted against the last vestiges of the dying sun. He couldn't hear their words, but he could see the tension in their bodies. He saw Ilara take a step back, her hand raised as if to ward him off. He saw Julian reach for her. And then, terrified of what he might see next, terrified of being drawn into the world of these beautiful, complicated people, he had turned and fled back to the safety of the clattering dishes and the loud music. He had retreated into his invisibility, locking the memory away, hoping it would fade like a bad dream. He didn't know that he held the key. He didn't know that his silence was a weapon, and that in the days to come it would be used to bury one man while protecting another. It was just a boy who had seen too much, a ghost at a party who was now haunted by the living, not the dead. The weight of that secret was a stone in his gut, and he was about to discover that some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The days following Illyra's disappearance bled into a grey, featureless fog. My world, once so vibrant, had been leached of all its color. Sleep was a stranger, and food tasted like cardboard. I existed in a state of suspended animation. My life paused on the last frame of that cursed video. The house we were supposed to fill with laughter and life was now an echo chamber of my grief. Every object a testament to her absence, her half-finished book on the nightstand, her favorite mug in the kitchen, the scent of her perfume lingering in the closet like a phantom limb dot. My arrest was a brutal public spectacle. Harding had orchestrated it for maximum impact. They came for me at dawn, two black and white cruisers screaming down my quiet suburban street, their lights painting the houses in frantic strokes of red and blue. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. I was led out in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into my wrists, the shame, a physical weight that bowed my head. The flash of a news camera blinded me. By noon, my face was plastered across every local news channel. The headline, a searing brand, architect husband arrested in bride's disappearance. The injustice was a suffocating poison. In the interrogation room, Harding's cruelty escalated. He was no longer just a detective seeking the truth. He was a predator toying with his meal. He'd leave me in the humming silence for hours, then burst in, his face contorted with rage, slamming his fist on the table. He'd push blown up, grainy photos of the blood-stained dress in my face, his voice a torrent of accusations. Look at it, Leo. Look what you did. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and you turned it into a bloodbath. I was looking for her, I'd repeat, my voice a hollow shell of what it once was. I fell. I was cut. A likely story. He'd sneer, his face inches from mine. Tell me again how you got that gash on your arm. Tripped over a log. Or did she scratch you as you were dragging her into the woods? Did she fight back? Leo. Was she strong? He was trying to break me, to plant a seed of doubt in my own mind, to make me confess to a crime I hadn't committed, just to make the torture stop. He painted a picture of me as a monster, a jealous, rage-filled husband. He twisted my love for Ilara into a possessive obsession, my grief into a calculated performance. The media, fed a steady diet of leaks from Harding's office, devoured the narrative. I was tried and convicted in the court of public opinion before I even had a chance to enter a plea. My betrayal was absolute. Friends who had clapped me on the back at my wedding now averted their gazes. Their calls stopped. The silence on the other end of the line was an indictment. They saw the same news reports, the same damning headlines. The seeds of doubt Harding had planted were taking root everywhere. The most painful betrayal, however, came from Julian. He played the part of the devastated brother to perfection. He gave tearful interviews on the courthouse steps, his voice thick with a well-rehearsed sorrow. "I can't believe it," he'd say, his handsome face a mask of anguish as he looked directly into the news cameras. "Leo loved her. He couldn't. But the police, they have evidence. I just want to find Ilara. I just want to bring her home." He visited me once in jail. He sat on the other side of the thick plexiglass, his tailored suit, a stark contrast to my orange jumpsuit. He looked at me with eyes full of pity, a pity that felt more like contempt. "Leo, what happened?" he asked, his voice a soft, conspiratorial whisper. "You can tell me. I'm your brother. Did you two fight? Did things get out of hand?" He was offering me a way out, a pre-packaged confession that would paint me as a tragic figure, not a cold-blooded killer, a crime of passion. Manslaughter, not murder. He was trying to control the narrative, to shape my guilt into something more palatable. "You were there, Julian," I said, my voice flat, dead. "You saw her. You followed her to the well." A flicker of something cold and hard passed through his eyes before the mask of sorrow slipped back into place. "Leo, you're not thinking straight. The stress, the grief, it's making you paranoid. I was with guests. Dozens of people saw me. I was worried about you, about Ilara. I went to look for you both." He was so convincing, so smooth. He had an alibi for every second, a witness for every moment. He had built a fortress of lies around himself, and I was the one trapped in the dungeon beneath it. He was using my love for Ilara, my grief, my confusion, as a weapon against me. He was framing me, and he was doing it with a brother's loving concern. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Meanwhile, Sam, the boy who held the key, was being crushed by the weight of his secret. He saw my face on the news every night. He heard the whispers in his small town. "The husband did it," they'd say. Always the husband. Each word was a turn of the screw, tightening the knot of fear and guilt in his stomach. Harding had interviewed him, of course. A brief, dismissive conversation. "Did you see anything unusual, kid?" Sam, terrified of the imposing detective, terrified of the man with the hungry eyes, had shaken his head. "No, sir. I was just clearing tables." He had made himself invisible again, retreating into the safety of silence. But the image of that confrontation by the well was burned into his mind. He couldn't sleep. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, the silent movie playing on a loop in his head, Ilara stepping back, Julian reaching for her. He started skipping school. He'd spend his days walking in the woods behind the wedding venue, drawn back to the scene of the crime, as if hoping to find an answer that would absolve him of his silence. One afternoon, he saw Julian there. He was standing by the old stone well, staring down into it. He wasn't the grieving brother from the television. His face was cold, calculating. He nudged a loose stone at the edge of the well with the toe of his expensive shoe, watching it dislodge and fall into the darkness. The sound of it hitting the bottom never came. Sam had ducked behind a tree, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was looking at a killer. And the killer knew he had a secret. Julian hadn't seen him, but Sam felt his presence like a physical threat. The danger was no longer an abstract concept on a screen. It was real, and it was standing 20 feet away from him. The struggle inside him was a war, fear versus conscience. To speak up meant inviting the wrath of a powerful, dangerous man. It meant becoming visible, a target. It meant admitting he had lied to the police. But to stay silent meant letting an innocent man rot in jail. It meant living with the knowledge that he had let a killer walk free. He thought of Laura, the kind-faced woman who looked like a sad princess. He thought of me, the man on the TV whose eyes looked as lost and broken as he felt. The weight of it all was becoming unbearable. The injustice was no longer just a story on the news. It was his story now, too. And he was standing at a crossroads, with the path of fear leading to a lifetime of regret, and the path of courage leading to an unknown, and possibly deadly, confrontation with the truth. The pressure was building, and Sam was about to break. The turning point came not with a bang, but with a whisper. A digital whisper buried in the cloud. Miller, my beleaguered public defender, was a bulldog. He lacked the polish of a hyperist corporate lawyer, but he possessed a dogged, methodical tenacity. He believed in my innocence, or at least, he believed in the state's obligation to prove my guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And he knew Harding's case was a house of cards built on circumstantial evidence and a coerced narrative. He filed motion after motion, demanding access to every scrap of data related to the wedding. The venue's Wi-Fi logs, the guests' social media posts, the raw, unedited files from every camera and phone that had been present. It was a fishing expedition, a desperate search for a single anomaly, a crack in the prosecution's perfect story. And he found it. The lead videographer, a harried artist named Carlos, had used a cloud-based service to back up his footage in real time. It was a failsafe, a protection against equipment failure. Among the dozens of gigabytes of high video, there was another folder, one Carlos had forgotten about. It was labeled audio tests. Early in the day, before the guests arrived, his assistant had placed a series of small, discreet lavalier microphones around the garden, one clipped to the floral arch, where we would say our vows, one tucked into the centerpiece on the head table, and one, almost as an afterthought, placed on a small table near the old stone well, hidden behind a pot of hydrangeas. The idea was to capture the ambient sounds of the garden, the birdsong, the rustle of leaves, to be mixed into the final video for a richer, more immersive experience. They had forgotten to turn it off. For 12 straight hours, that tiny forgotten microphone had been listening. It had recorded everything. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, and the final conversation between Ilara and Julian. Miller played it for me in the sterile grey visitors' room at the county jail. He slid a pair of headphones over my ears, his face grim. Listen, Leo. All of it. The recording was faint at first, muffled by the sounds of the party. But then, as the music faded and the crowd thinned, two voices emerged from the static, sharp and clear under the twilight sky. Ilara's and Julian's. "Leave me alone, Julian," Ilara's voice said. It was tight, strained, stripped of its usual warmth. It was the voice of a woman cornered. "I can't," Julian's voice replied, smooth, seductive, but with a hard, dangerous edge. "Not until you admit it. You made a mistake. You married the wrong brother." My hands clenched into fists. Every muscle in my body went rigid. "There was never a choice," she shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. "It was always Leo. It was never you. I don't love you. I have never loved you. I love your brother, my husband." The word husband was a shield, a wall she was desperately trying to build between them. "You're lying," Julian hissed. "I see the way you look at me when he's not around. I feel it. You settled for him. You settled for a quiet life, for a man who builds boring houses, because you're afraid. You're afraid of a real man, of a real passion. You call this passion," her voice was laced with disgust, "this obsession, this sickness. You've been stalking me for months, Julian. The notes, the anonymous gifts. I knew it was you. I told you to stop. I begged you." The world tilted on its axis. The anonymous gifts. A rare orchid had appeared on our doorstep a month before the wedding. A first edition of her favorite book of poetry. I had thought they were from me, a secret admirer. I was playing the part of she had seemed unsettled by them, and I couldn't understand why. Now, the memory was sickening. He had been inserting himself into our life, a poison seeping through the cracks. "I did it to show you what you were missing," he said, his voice rising. "He gives you stability. I can give you the world, Elara. I can give you everything he can't." "I don't want the world," she cried, her voice breaking. "I want him. I want my life, the one we chose, the one you are trying to destroy. Now, get out of my way. I'm going back to my husband." There was the sound of a scuffle, a rustling of fabric, the silk of her dress, a sharp intake of breath. "You're not going anywhere." Julian's voice was a low growl, the charm stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. "You think I'd let you walk back there and tell him, ruin me, after everything I've done to get this far? Get your hands off me," she screamed. Then, a sickening thud, a heavy, final sound. It was followed by a sharp, cracking noise. And then, silence. A profound, terrifying silence, broken only by the chirping of a lone cricket. My headphones were ripped from my ears. I was on my feet, shouting, my voice a raw animal sound of pure rage and grief. Guards burst into the room, pinning me against the wall, but I didn't feel them. All I could hear was that final, sickening thud, echoing in the chambers of my skull. Miller stood his ground, holding up the small digital recorder. "This is evidence of a murder," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "And it my client, the conspiracy, the full, horrifying truth, was no longer a secret, buried in my gut. It was here, an undeniable audio file. Julian hadn't just wanted Elara. He had been systematically trying to undermine our relationship, to poison her against me, and when his twisted fantasy was finally, irrevocably rejected, he hadn't just snapped, he had silenced her. The torn dress, my blood. It was all part of his meticulous, diabolical plan. He must have attacked her. She had fought back, scratching him, getting his blood knot mine under her fingernails. In the struggle, he had torn her dress, he had killed her. Then, knowing I would come looking for her, knowing I would be frantic, he had taken the dress, planted it in the woods, and waited for me to stumble through the darkness, creating the very evidence that would frame me. He hadn't just murdered my wife, he had tried to murder my life, my future, my very identity. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer about my personal pain, my private grief. This was about a monster who was walking free, a man who had manipulated the law, the media, and everyone around him. He had turned my love story into a horror film and cast me as the villain. The tension in the room was electric. The guards looked at each other, their aggression turning to confusion. I stood, breathing heavily, my mind racing. The audio was the key, but it wasn't enough. Julian was powerful, connected. He would have the best lawyers money could buy. They would claim the tape was doctored, that it was inconclusive. We needed more. We needed the one person who could place Julian at that well, at that exact moment. "Sam," I gasped, looking at Miller, my eyes wild. "The boy who bust the tables, his name is Sam." Harding interviewed him. "He lied, he must have seen something. We have to find him." The hunt for justice had begun, and the fuse had just been lit on a scandal that was about to explode, blowing the lid off a story far more shocking than the one Harding had tried to sell. The courtroom would be our stage, and that audio recording would be the bombshell that brought the whole rotten structure crashing down. The tension was at its absolute peak. Julian thought he had one. He had no idea the ghost of his victim was about to speak. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, simmering with a toxic stew of media, speculation, public outrage, and the cold, calculated machinations of the law. It was standing room only. Every seat was filled with reporters, curious locals, and the ghosts of my former life friends who now looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. At the prosecution's table, Harding sat with a smug, self-satisfied air, whispering to the district attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Renner who looked at me as if I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. At the defendant's table, I sat beside Miller, a man transformed. His frayed collar had been replaced by a crisp, starched one. His exhaustion had been replaced by a coiled, focused energy. He was no longer just a public defender. He was a warrior, armed with the truth, and across the courtroom, in the front row of the gallery, sat Julian. He was the picture of tragic nobility, his face etched with concern for his misguided brother. He would occasionally catch my eye and give me a small, sad shake of his head, a masterful piece of theater for the jury. He had no idea what was coming. He believed the audio recording was a desperate bluff. His lawyers had filed motion after motion to have it dismissed as inadmissible, doctored, a cheap trick. The trial had been a brutal, systematic dismantling of my life. Renner had paraded a series of witnesses who painted me as a possessive, jealous husband, a florist who testified I'd had a heated argument with her about the wedding arrangements, a caterer who claimed I'd been drinking heavily. It was all half-truths and twisted perceptions, woven together to create a tapestry of guilt. Then, Miller began his defense. His first witness was Carlos, the videographer, who authenticated the existence of the audio files, explaining the forgotten microphone by the well. Renner's cross-examination was vicious, but Carlos held firm. The files were real, unedited, and time-stamped. The air in the courtroom crackled with anticipation as Miller announced, "The defense calls Samuel Rourke to the stand." A ripple went through the gallery. Sam, looking impossibly small and frail, walked slowly towards the witness stand. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands trembling. He looked like a lamb being led to the slaughter. When he was sworn in, his voice was a barely audible squeak. Miller approached him gently, his voice soft. "Sam, can you tell the court where you were on the evening of June 14th? At the wedding," Sam whispered. "I was bussing tables. Did you see anything unusual that evening? Anything at all?" Sam swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He risked a fleeting glance at Julian. Julian gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning, a threat. Sam's eyes darted to me. I looked at him, not with pressure, but with a silent plea. I tried to pour all of my grief, my innocence, my desperation into that one look. "Tell the truth, please." Sam took a deep breath. I lied," he said, his voice cracking, but growing stronger with each word. "I lied to the detective." Harding stiffened at the prosecution table. Renner shot to her feet. "Objection. The witness is admitting to perjury. It's a bit late to be worried about the truth, isn't it, Ms. Renner?" The judge said dryly, overruling her. "Continue, Mr. Miller." "Why did you lie, Sam?" Miller asked gently. "I was scared." He finally looked at Julian, his gaze, now steady, defiant. Of him, he pointed a trembling finger. Of Julian Croft. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Julian's mask of sorrow finally cracked. A flash of pure fury crossed his face before he smoothed it back into an expression of shocked disbelief. "Sam." Miller's voice was a steady anchor in the storm. "Tell the court what you saw." And he did. In a halting, but clear voice, Sam recounted everything. He described seeing Alara walk towards the well, followed moments later by Julian. He described the tension in their silhouettes against the twilight sky. He described Alara stepping back, her hand raised. He described Julian reaching for her. "And then what did you do?" Miller asked. "I ran," Sam said, shame coloring his cheeks. "I was scared. I hid. I didn't want to see." Renner's cross-examination was merciless. She tore into him, painting him as a confused, starstruck kid, a fantasist who wanted his 15 minutes of fame. "You saw silhouettes, Mr. Rock, from over 100 feet away. You couldn't hear anything. You admit you ran away. How can you possibly be sure of what you saw?" "Because of the way he looked," Sam said, his voice ringing with a newfound convictio. "When he was walking towards her, I've seen that look before. In movies, it's the look the monster has. Right before it attacks." It was a childish description, but it was devastatingly effective. The jury was rapt. Then came the moment of detonation. "Your Honor," Miller said, his voice booming through the silent courtroom, "the defense would now like to play the audio recording recovered from the microphone at the well." Julian's lawyer was on his feet, shouting objections, but the judge, her face a thundercloud, slammed her gavel down. "Play it." The courtroom was plunged into an unnerving silence, broken only by the faint chirping of a cricket from the recording. And then, the voices, Alaris, desperate and defiant. Julian's, slick and predatory. The entire courtroom listened, spellbound, to the last moments of a woman's life. They heard her declare her love for me. They heard her unmask Julian as a stalker. They heard her scream. And then they heard the thud. The sound was obscene in the sterile environment of the court. It was a visceral, sickening noise that made several jurors flinch. A woman in the gallery sobbed, in the recording's sudden, deafening silence. I looked at Julian. His face was ashen, his composure shattered. The blood had drained from his face, leaving a waxy grey pallor. He was staring at the witness stand, at Sam, with eyes full of pure, murderous hatred. He was no longer the grieving brother. He was the monster, unmasked. But the recording wasn't over. After the thud, after the cricket, after 10 seconds of horrifying silence, there was another sound, a faint, metallic scraping. And then, a grunt of exertion. And then, a heavy, wet splash. The sound of something hitting water. Deep water. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were scrambling for the doors. The judge was banging her gavel, shouting for order, but it was useless. The bombshell had landed. Harding, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, was no longer looking at me. He was staring at Julian, the realization dawning on him. He had been played. He had been so blinded by his textbook theory of the guilty husband that he had ignored the real killer hiding in plain sight. In the chaos, I saw it. A single detective, unobserved by the others, quietly slipped out of the courtroom. The judge called for a recess, but it was too late. The trial was over. Justice wasn't happening by the book anymore. It was happening live, in a chaotic, explosive spectacle. As they led me out of the courtroom, back to a holding cell, I saw Julian being surrounded by his lawyers, his face a rictus of panic. He was trapped. The audio, combined with Sam's testimony, had buried him. An hour later, a guard came to my cell. "You have a visitor," he said, his voice holding a new note of respect. It was Detective Harding. He didn't look at me. He stared at the wall, his jaw tight. "The dive team is at the wedding venue," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "They're prepping to go into the well." He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw not a tormentor, but a man grappling with a profound failure. "The DA is dropping all charges against you, Leo. You're free to go." He slid a key into the lock. The click of the bolts sliding back was the loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I was free. But the cinematic payoff wasn't just my freedom. It was happening a few miles away, in a sun-drenched garden, where a dive team was preparing to bring the truth up from the darkness. The public exposure, the irrefutable proof, was about to be pulled from the bottom of that old stone well, and the splash it would make would be heard around the world. Julian's fate was sealed, not by a gavel, but by a splash in the dark. Recorded by a forgotten microphone, the world outside the jail was a blinding, disorienting assault on the senses. The air, fresh and cool against my skin, felt alien after months of recycled, sterile air. The colors seemed too bright, the sounds too loud. Freedom didn't feel like a triumphant release. It felt like being born into a world I no longer recognized. Miller shielded me from the ravenous pack of reporters, guiding me through the throng to his waiting car. The flashbulbs were a strobing, silent explosion, but this time, they weren't capturing the face of a monster. They were capturing the face of a ghost. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The house was a mausoleum of a life that no longer existed. Instead, Miller drove me to a secluded hotel, a place of anonymous corridors and empty rooms. For the first time in months, I was alone. Truly alone. And the silence was heavier than any prison wall. The news was everywhere, a digital wildfire. The courtroom audio was played on a loop. Julian's face, contorted in panic, was juxtaposed with my own, gaunt and haunted. The narrative had flipped. With breathtaking speed, I was no longer the villain. I was the tragic victim, the grieving husband who had been framed by his own brother. The public's outrage, once directed at me, now fell upon Julian with the force of a tidal wave. They found her that evening. The dive team, working under powerful floodlights that turned the once romantic garden into a harsh clinical crime scene, pulled her from the depths of the well. The news footage was respectful, shot from a distance, but the image of the white body bag being lifted from the darkness is seared into my memory forever. They had found Alara. They had brought her home. Julian was arrested on the courthouse steps as he tried to flee. The image was iconic. The powerful, handsome man in the bespoke suit, his face a mask of terror, being forced to his knees on the same spot where he had performed his tearful, duplicitous interviews. His downfall was as public and spectacular as his life had been. The monster had been caged. There was no catharsis in it. There was no soaring feeling of victory. There was only a vast hollow emptiness. Justice had been served, but it was a cold, bitter meal. It couldn't bring her back. It couldn't erase the months of torment, the loss of my dignity, the public shaming. It couldn't unring the bell. I attended her funeral a week later. It was a small private affair, a stark contrast to the spectacle of our wedding. We buried her in a quiet cemetery on a hill overlooking the ocean. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the color she had loved. I stood by her grave, the polished granite of her headstone cold beneath my fingers. Alara Croft, it read. Beloved wife. The dates of her birth and death were a brutal mathematical summary of a life cut short. After the others had left, two figures approached me. It was Sam and his uncle. The boy looked different. The shield of his headphones was gone. He stood a little taller, the fear in his eyes replaced by a quiet, somber maturity. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a small, folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was a charcoal sketch, rendered with a surprising, delicate skill. It was Alara, not the bride from the video, but the girl from the library. Her head was tilted, a slight, knowing smile on her lips, her eyes full of a light that no darkness could ever truly extinguish. He had captured her essence, her soul. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry I waited. You were brave, Sam, I said, my own voice hoarse. You did the right thing. You gave her a voice. He nodded, unable to speak, and let his uncle lead him away. I looked at the sketch, a bittersweet ache in my chest. This was the Alara I would keep. Not the victim, but the artist, the woman, who had found beauty in a cracked pavement and taught me how to see the world. I live a quiet life now, in a small town by the sea, far from the city and its ghosts. I design houses again, but they are different. They are smaller, more intimate, with big windows to let in the light. I am no longer building fortresses. I am building sanctuaries. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the wedding video, not the police copy, but my own. I fast forward through the cake cutting, the dancing, the faces of guests who would later abandon me. I go to the very beginning, to the first few frames. It's a shot of Alara getting ready. She is sitting in front of a mirror, and for a moment, she catches my eye through the reflection. She smiles, a pure, unguarded smile meant only for me. It's a moment of perfect, unscripted peace, before the world intruded. Before the shadows gathered, the cost of the truth was immeasurable. It cost Alara her life. It cost me my world. Justice prevailed, but the scars remain. There is no neat ending, no bittersweet healing that erases the pain. There is only the lingering echo of what was lost. The haunting reflection in a mirror. The charcoal sketch of a girl in a library, and the endless aching blue of a sky that will forever remind me of her. The story is over, but the silence she left behind will last a lifetime.